Welcome to a fireside reading of David Copperfield by Charles Dickens, Chapter 57, Part 1, The Emigrants. One thing more I had to do before yielding myself to the shock of these emotions. It was to conceal what had occurred from those who were going away, and to dismiss them on their voyage in happy ignorance. In this, no time was to be lost. I took Mr. Micawber aside that same night and confided to him the task of standing between Mr. Peggotty and intelligence of the late catastrophe. He zealously undertook to do so and to intercept any newspaper through which it might, without such precautions, reach him. "If it penetrates to him, sir," said Mr. Micawber, striking himself on the breast, "it shall first pass through this body." Mr. Micawber, I must observe, in his adaptation of himself to a new state of society, had acquired a bold, buccaneering air, not absolutely lawless, but defensive and prompt. One might have supposed him a child of the wilderness, long accustomed to live out of the confines of civilization and about to return to his native wilds. He had provided himself, among other things, with a complete suit of oilskin and a straw hat with a very low crown, pitched or corked on the outside. In this rough clothing, with a common mariner's telescope under his arm and a shrewd trick of casting up his eye at the sky as looking out for dirty weather, he was far more nautical after his manner than Mr. Peggotty. His whole family, if I may so express it, were cleared for action. I found Mrs. Micawber in the closest and most uncompromising of bonnets, made fast under the chin, and in a shawl which tied her up, as I had been tied up when my aunt first received me, like a bundle, and was secured behind at the waist in a strong knot. Miss Micawber I found made snug for stormy weather in the same manner, with nothing superfluous about her. Master Micawber was hardly visible in a Guernsey shirt and the shaggiest suit of slops I ever saw, and the children were done up like preserved meats in impervious cases. Both Mr. Micawber and his eldest son wore their sleeves loosely turned back at the wrists, as being ready to lend a hand in any direction, and to tumble up or sing out "Yo, heave, yo" on the shortest notice. Thus Traddles and I found them at nightfall, assembled on the wooden steps at that time known as Hungerford Stairs, watching the departure of a boat with some of their property on board. I had told Traddles of the terrible event, and it had greatly shocked him, but there could be no doubt of the kindness of keeping it a secret, and he had come to help me in this last service. It was here that I took Mr. Micawber aside and received his promise. The Micawber family were lodged in a little dirty, tumble-down public house, which in those days was close to the stairs, and whose protruding wooden rooms overhung the river. The family, as emigrants, being objects of some interest in and about Hungerford, attracted so many beholders that we were glad to take refuge in their room. It was one of the wooden chambers upstairs, with the tide flowing underneath. My aunt and Agnes were there, busily making some little extra comforts in the way of dress for the children. Peggotty was quietly assisting with the old insensible workbox, yard measure, and bit of wax candle before her that had now outlived so much. It was not easy to answer her inquiries, still less to whisper Mr. Peggotty, when Mr. Micawber brought him in, that I had given the letter and all was well. But I did both, and made them happy. If I showed any trace of what I felt, My own sorrows were sufficient to account for it. "And when does the ship sail, Mr. Micawber?" asked my aunt. Mr. Micawber considered it necessary to prepare either my aunt or his wife by degrees, and said, "Sooner than he had expected yesterday." "The boat brought you word, I suppose," said my aunt. "It did, ma'am," he returned. "Well," said my aunt, "and she sails?" "Madam," he replied, "I am informed that we must positively be on board before 7 tomorrow morning." "Hey-day," said my aunt. "That's soon. Is it a sea-going fact, Mr. Peggotty?" "'Tis so, ma'am. She'll drop down the river with that there tide. If Master Davy and my sister comes aboard at Gravesend, arternoon and next day they'll see the last on us." "And that we shall do," said I. "Be sure." "Until then, and until we are at sea," observed Mr. Micawber with a glance of intelligence at me, "Mr. Peggotty and myself—" excuse me. "Mr. Peggotty and myself will constantly keep a double lookout together on our goods and chattels." "Emma, my love," said Mr. Micawber, clearing his throat in his magnificent way, "my friend Mr. Thomas Traddles is so obliging as to solicit in my ear that he should have the privilege of ordering the ingredients necessary to the composition of a moderate portion of that beverage, which is peculiarly associated in our minds with the roast beef of old England. I allude, in short, punch. Under ordinary circumstances, I should scruple to entreat the indulgence of Miss Trotwood and Miss Wickfield, but I can only say for myself," said my aunt, "that I will drink all happiness and success to you, Mr. Micawber, with the utmost pleasure." "And I too," said Agnes with a smile. Mr. Micawber immediately descended to the bar, where he appeared to be quite at home, and in due time returned with a steaming jug. I could not but observe that he had been peeling the lemons with his own clasp knife, which, as became the knife of a practical settler, was about a foot long, and which he wiped, not wholly without ostentation, on the sleeve of his coat. Mrs. Micawber and the two elder members of the family I now found to be provided with similar formidable instruments, while every child had its own wooden spoon attached to its body by a strong line. In a similar anticipation of life afloat and in the bush, Mr. Micawber, instead of helping Mrs. Micawber and his eldest son and daughter to punch in wine glasses, which he might easily have done, for there was a shelf full in the room, served it out to them in a series of villainous little tin pots, and I never saw him enjoy anything so much as drinking out of his own particular pint pot and putting it in his pocket at the close of the evening. "The luxuries of the old country," said Mr. Micawber, with an intense satisfaction in their renouncement, "we abandon. The denizens of the forest cannot, of course, expect to participate in the refinements of the land of the free." Here a boy came in to say that Mr. Micawber was wanted downstairs. "I have a presentiment," said Mrs. Micawber, setting down her tin pot, "that it is a member of my family." "If so, my dear," observed Mr. Micawber with his usual suddenness of warmth on that subject, "as the member of your family, whoever he, she, or it may be, has kept us waiting for a considerable period, perhaps the member may now wait my convenience." "Micawber," said his wife in a low tone, "at such a time as this—" "It is not meet," said Mr. Micawber, rising, "that every nice offence should bear its comment. Emma, I stand reproved." "The loss," Micawber observed his wife, "has been my family's, not yours. If my family are at length sensible of the deprivation to which their own conduct has in the past exposed them, and now desire to extend the hand of fellowship, let it not be repulsed." "My dear," he returned, "so be it." "If not for their sakes, for mine, Micawber," said his wife. "Emma," he returned, "that view of the question is, at such a moment, irresistible. I cannot even now distinctly pledge myself to fall upon your family's neck, but the member of your family who is now in attendance shall have no genial warmth frozen by me." Mr. Micawber withdrew and was absent some little time, in the course of which Mrs. Micawber was not wholly free from an apprehension that words might have arisen between him and the member. At length the same boy appeared and presented to me with a note written in pencil and headed in a legal manner, "Heap versus Micawber." From this document I learned that Mr. Micawber, being again arrested, was in a final paroxysm of despair, and that he begged me to send him his knife and pint pot by bearer, as they might prove serviceable during the brief remainder of his existence in jail. He also requested, as a last act of friendship, that I would see his family to the parish workhouse and forget that such a being ever existed. Of course, I answered this note by going down with the boy to pay the money, where I found Mr. Micawber sitting in a corner, looking darkly at the sheriff's officer who had effected the capture. On his release, he embraced me with the utmost fervour and made an entry of the transaction in his pocket-book, very particular, I recollect, being about a halfpenny I had inadvertently omitted from my statement of the total. This momentous pocket-book was a timely reminder to him of another transaction on our return to the room upstairs, where he accounted for his absence by saying that it had been occasioned by circumstances over which he had no control. He took out of it a large sheet of paper, folded small and quite covered with long sums carefully worked. From the glimpse I had of them, I should say that I had never saw such sums out of a school ciphering book. These, it seemed, were calculations of compound interest on what he called the principal amount of 41, 10, 11 and half for various periods. After a careful consideration of these and an elaborate estimate of his resources, he had come to the conclusion to select that sum which represented the amount with compound interest to 2 years, 15 calendar months, and 14 days from that date. For this, he had drawn a note of hand with great neatness, which he handed over to Traddles on the spot, a discharge of his debt in full, as between man and man, with many acknowledgments. "I have still a presentiment," said Mrs. Micawber, pensively shaking her head, "that my family will appear on board before we finally depart." Mr. Micawber evidently had his presentiment on the subject too, but he put it in his tin pot and swallowed it. "If you have any opportunity of sending letters home on your passage, Mrs. Micawber," said my aunt, "you must let us hear from you, you know." Oh, I have the wrong voice. I'll go back. "If you have any opportunity of sending letters home on your passage, Mrs. Micawber," said my aunt, "you must let us hear from you, you know." "My dear Miss Trotwood," she replied, "I shall be only too happy to think that anyone expects to hear from us. I shall not fail to correspond. Mr. Copperfield, I trust, as an old and familiar friend, you will not object to receive occasional intelligence himself from one who knew him when the twins were not unconscious." I said that I should hope to hear whenever she had an opportunity of writing. "Please heaven, there will be many such opportunities," said Micawber. "The ocean in these times is a perfect fleet of ships, and we can hardly fail to encounter many in running over." "It is merely crossing," said Mr. Micawber, trifling with his eyeglass. "Merely crossing. The distance is quite imaginary." I think now how odd it was, but how wonderfully like Mr. Micawber, that when he went from London to Canterbury, he should have talked as if he were going to the farthest limits of the earth, and when he went from England to Australia, as if he were going for a little trip across the Channel. "On the voyage, I shall endeavour," said Mr. Micawber, "occasionally to spin them a yarn, and the melody of my son Wilkins will, I trust, be acceptable at the galley fire. When Mrs. Micawber has her sea legs on, an expression in which I hope there is no conventional impropriety, she will give them, I dare say, a little tafflin. Porpoises and dolphins, I believe, will be frequently observed athwart our bows, and either on the starboard or the larboard quarter objects of interest will be continually descried. In short," said Mr. Micawber, with the old genteel air, "the probability is all would be found so exciting, alow and aloft, that when the lookout stationed in the maintop cries, 'Land ho!' we shall be very considerably astonished." With that, he flourished off the contents of his little tin pot as if he had made the voyage and had passed a first-class examination before the highest naval authorities. Thanks so much for joining me. More tomorrow, same time and place, 5 Pacific at Fireside Reading on Instagram. All chapters uploaded to the YouTube channel, Fireside Reading. I hope you're enjoying this as much as I am. I'm sure you are. Until I see you soon, please stay very well. Good night.